How's everyone doing today? Welcome back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Mardiege, on a Wednesday here today, January 15th, getting closer to the start of the next round of the playoffs. But since we got kind of like a break period here in between the week where I don't want to talk too quickly about the playoffs, just kind of to get it out of the way, I thought I'd bring up some other topics that are playoff related, but just not technically talking about the games directly. So we're going to be talking about the teams that lost in the Wildcard round and how they can improve in 2025. There is a couple of rematches in this round of the playoffs as well. So with two teams being very familiar with each other, we're going to point out one thing that each team can do to get the upper hand over a very familiar opponent, and touching on more of the Cowboys head coaching search and the Vikings quarterback situation as well. That is coming up on today's show and much more, so make sure to stick around for all of that on today's episode. But before we get started, I'd like to remind you guys, if you guys want to get involved with the show through a question, a comment, any opinion you'd like to share during the live show, please don't hesitate to do so. Any input and insight you guys give and add to the show really does exactly that. It adds to it, it adds a different perspective, and it just makes the show a lot more interactive and a lot more interesting, I feel like. So if you want to make it absolutely sure that your message stands out and gets featured on any of the live shows, there's an easy way to do that for you guys, just by using the new Super Chat feature. Just click the $ at the bottom of the chat box and send in your Super Chat. This way, it guarantees that your message gets on the air, I'm able to read it, and take the conversation maybe in a different direction. It always makes it a lot more fluid, and you just never know. So we rely also on your support to keep bringing you the content you love, and we appreciate every bit of it. So again, let us know what you're thinking, hit the Super Chat button, and get involved with the show. But now with that out of the way, we could start talking about a few things here. Starting off with the Cowboys, right? Just quickly, because we did touch on them a little bit yesterday in a couple different segments, but this is a bit more of a development when it comes to the Cowboys and their head coaching search, because I briefly mentioned it yesterday how Dallas was, it felt like, I don't know if I was the only person thinking it, but it felt like with them moving on from Mike McCarthy, right once they finally came to a final decision on that, quickly and moved over to Deion Sanders, right? Just like in the blink of an eye, we were quickly just moving on to Deion Sanders. And you got those reports, and not only that, but you also have sources telling CBS Sports that the Cowboys decision makers took part in a hiring sort of training session, pretty much a mandatory step for NFL teams to actually start looking for head coaches and or GMs. Basically anybody that they want to hire, they got to go through this sort of virtual training that's mandated by the NFL. And furthermore, those sources claim that it was less than 2 hours after the news of Mike McCarthy and the Dallas Cowboys, sort of broke yesterday around noon. Once that came out, it was less than 2 hours after that the Cowboys decision makers were already taking this sort of virtual training regimen, right, that they have to go through, already thinking about the next step and sort of being proactive, right? And that's the first thing that I wanted to bring up, because we haven't really seen the Cowboys be proactive and be, trying to stay ahead of the course, right? They always, kind of take their time and really are very diligent, I guess, to put it nicely, with looking and making big decisions. But this kind of surprised me. Pretty uncharacteristic of the Cowboys to be very fluid and just looking ahead. Once something didn't work out, they're on to the next, which I thought, is good, but I just wasn't expecting it. So that's one thing, right? How quickly the Cowboys moved on from it. But also, when you do move on from something like this, it's not an easy decision, right? Obviously, but it makes you think that they got somebody in mind already, right? They have somebody lined up in case Mike McCarthy fell through. And now that we're at this step, right away we moved over to Deion, and it makes you think, right, that that's the guy. That's the guy that they had lined up. They always wanted Dion, sooner rather than later. So now that Mike McCarthy has decided to part ways, now they could really go after Deion Sanders. And it's not a bad option, right, obviously, but it's not only Dion. Sources also say that Bill Belichick is another one that the Cowboys are still interested in because of his good relationship with Jerry Jones. But, with both Dion and Bill Belichick in the college ranks now, you got the buyout clauses. Bill Belichick has an even higher one of $10 million before June 1st, and it does get lowered to only $1 million after June 1st. But if you don't have a head coach until after June 1st, I don't think that's any way the right approach to trying to hire a head coach, right? By the time June 1st rolls around, we're talking about, mini camp and things like that. There's no way that's even an option. So his buyout clause is even higher than Dion's at $8 million. If they want to hire them, they got to pay that to the university. So it's not only the money, obviously, but if Dion and Jerry are going to have some issues like we sort of assumed in yesterday's segment, you can only imagine Bill and Jerry are going to have at least the same amount, if not more, because Bill has been famously known to be the general manager and the head coach and really have his finger on the pulse of everything that's going on in New England. So that's exactly what Jerry Jones does. So that if the money wasn't going to be an issue, that was certainly going to be something that I just couldn't really see through. So that's kind of where I was held up there with Dion and Bill Belichick, being connected to this spot. So maybe there's other candidates, right, that the Cowboys are after. And it is weird because the Cowboys waited so long to kind of move on from Mike McCarthy, right? They kind of missed the window where they could have interviewed Ben Johnson or Aaron Glenn. But because they're number one seeds, Aaron Glenn and Ben Johnson as the two most popular head coaching candidates, I would say, because the Cowboys, kind of missed that window already, because of the NFL rules, Dallas is not allowed to make any sort of contact with them until they either lose or until after the Super Bowl, because the Lions were one of the number one seeds, so they have different rules to, some of the other playoff teams, right? Some of the other playoff teams, if they want to interview some of their, coaching staff, they got to wait until 3 days after the wild card win or 3 days after the wild card loss, so they get a sense of, giving them a little bit of time, to do other things, right, because they're still playing, right? So that's another thing I kind of tossed around, but it still didn't really, move me too much, other than maybe some reports about Robert Saleh I think I heard of. There's not really been much on them pursuing like a Ben Johnson or Aaron Glenn or Joe Brady or Todd Monken, right? Some of the coordinators that are still playing, there's not been really much of that. So I kind of moved away from that. If it's not any of them, and if it's not going to be Dion or Bill Belichick, because I just don't believe that it will, then, who are they after? Why are they moving so quickly, to kind of move on and look for their next head coach, right? It seems like a rhetorical question because the head coach is obviously the most important position in the connection from front office to, actually talking about the players, right? The head coach is, in large part, a major part of that. So where could they be looking towards? And I saw another report that said that Jerry Jones was pretty fond of Jason Witten, and that was one of the options that I really wasn't considering. But after I read, this report from NFL media, after, last night, and the report came out last night saying how Jerry, allegedly, this is all just, based on what they're hearing. The report said that Jerry had spoken to Jason Witten already about the head coaching position with the Dallas Cowboys, and that in his ideal scenario, he wanted Jason Witten to be sort of the heir apparent to Mike McCarthy as part of the negotiations he was having with Mike McCarthy. And as you would imagine, Mike McCarthy was not really too big a fan of that, so that was also another reason why the negotiations kind of parted ways. And that was according to NFL media, of course, and obviously, it would have probably entailed like Jason Witten being like an assistant coach or assistant head coach or something like that to Mike McCarthy. And I think that in itself is a bit of just like ridiculousness from Jerry Jones if that was to be the case. But it feels like they just could be acting fast because for whatever reason, Jerry might have his eye on Jason Witten, maybe more than people are led on to believe. And like I said, it wasn't an option that I really thought was really being considered as a serious candidate. But I mean, you look at the other options and they kind of don't line up with how the Cowboys are moving recently, right? Because one of them is Bill Belichick, and you'd either have to pay that money or you're going to have to wait until after June 1st, which is not going to happen. And then you don't really hear about the interviews with anybody else. They don't have anything else lined up, and there's no reports or reported interest in anybody else. So if that's not the case, the obvious ones are really off the table, it might seem like right now, then it could be someone like Jason Witten, right? Someone completely outside of the box that Jerry, very fond of him, the connection's obviously there, for whatever reason, feels like he would be a good candidate for this job. And it seems very rushed if that does seem to be the case, because I can't imagine, no disrespect to Jason Witten, but I can't imagine he has many opportunities to be a head coach at this moment in time. He's never been a college coach. He's never had any other coaching experience except like high school, where he's currently at now. But, doing my best detective work and kind of piecing everything together the way I just kind of explained, I feel like the Cowboys are going to surprise a lot of people with who their head coach is going to be. And I mentioned Mike Zimmer yesterday, but there were some sources saying that he might be considering retirement. So that's a whole nother issue if he does retire, now that they have to find a new defensive coordinator. So maybe, just for you guys to think about it out there, maybe Jason Witten seems like a more realistic option than a lot of people are really considering at this point in time. Nothing the Cowboys do would really surprise me. I'm just putting that out there. So, I mean, I think any ideal fans, ideal candidate would be someone like Dion, right? If they were able to convince him. But I think up their sleeve, they're kind of plotting something that a lot of people are not going to be really expecting. So just like as a warning, don't be surprised if something crazy like that happens, right? In regards to the Cowboys, right? I feel like they're going to be pretty quick in deciding who their next leader is going to be. So keep an eye out for that. But we got a lot more to talk about on today's show, really regarding a lot of the playoff teams and former playoff teams now in 2024, 2025. The next segment is focusing on the wildcard round a little bit more. I can't be the only one that thought that there was a lot of blowouts in that game. There was a lot of disparity between the teams that lost and the teams that won in the first round of the playoffs. So we're going to talk about why there was such a huge difference. Is this a big problem? And is there any sort of quick resolution that we can get to in the coming years in the NFL? So we're going to touch on that when we return after this break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
We're back here on the Chip Shot Football Podcast today. Again, January 15th, here to backtrack a little bit, I'd say. Look back to the wild card round, and I had this on my mind for really the last day and a half. After, I kind of processed all the wild card games, I just kept going back to something that I kept repeating in my head. But not only just me while I was watching the wild card round, but also while I was texting my friends, watching these games and, just reacting to it, in our group chat. Something my friends and I kept saying this weekend, I feel like, was along the lines of, I'm about to turn this game off, or they need to get it together soon, or they're going to get blown out. They were among some of the unreasonable and the various amount of ways and chain of events that we were kind of listing off that needed to happen for the losing team to somehow overcome their poor performance and get back into this game. And all of that surrounding the idea that all of the wild card games were really just, it felt like they were not competitive for whatever reason, really different than what I was, I guess, expecting going into this round of the playoffs. And, with all the anticipation and really some of the individual storylines around each team. You had the Broncos and the Bills matchup, which a lot of people considered to be a potential upset with how well the Broncos were playing and whatnot. You had the Chargers and the best defense in terms of least amount of points scored. They were only allowing like 17 or 18 points per game. They were going up against the Texans that were pretty injured, riddled going into the playoffs. You had the Steelers, who I guess were definitely the worst wild card team in the AFC, but, they were playing Baltimore, and I heard people talking about how, they always play them tough. There's always something about them that the Ravens, struggle to figure out. There was those narratives, and then you go over to the NFC and look at the Packers. Can they repeat history? Are they capable of going to Philly? They played them close the first time. How can they do it again? They were in this same position last year. There was a lot of that, so it built it up, right? And then the 6th seed was actually the only game that was pretty competitive, so they're the only exception. But then you go over to the Vikings, and they were in contention of being the best team in the NFC. So going up against the Rams, you were expecting this to be an absolute classic. But all of the games except the Commanders and Buccaneers game were really non-competitive at all. All of them were at least victories by the home team by at least 14 points or more. All of the home teams, like I mentioned, won, and except the Commanders. And once they got the lead in most of these games, that was pretty much it. Once they got the lead at any point in these games, you never saw any sort of comeback effort or really any moment where you felt like the Steelers are coming back here. They scored 2 touchdowns, but I never really felt that it was going to lead to anything. Or the Chargers, holding close in the second half, could they get something together? Then they go out and throw a bunch of interceptions, so that was pretty disappointing. The Packers, Josh Jacobs scores that touchdown, right? It's a 1-score game, but by that point, their defense is pretty much worn out, and they don't really have a response anymore. So those were just among some of the things that occurred in these games, and all the second halves, just overall were just desperate attempts from the visiting team to show some fight. You give them credit for that, but you never really thought that it was going to amount to anything. And over the weekend, of course, we also saw Herbert throw 4 interceptions, Jordan Love throw 3 more interceptions, the Steelers punting on 4 straight drives to start the game. Denver, I guess, kind of showed you something to start the game, but then after that, they punted 4 times. They went 4 and out 2 more times, and they missed a field goal as well. And all the lower seeds lost this year, obviously, and going back to last year as well they did too. Last year, all the lower seeds lost except only one of the wildcard games that was closer than 14 points, but in 5 out of the 6 games in the wild card rounds last year in 2023, the higher seed usually won. So it feels like it's a little bit of a trend now, right? You could say that the higher seed's supposed to win, right? But I think that, yes, the higher seed's supposed to win, but I think some of the allure of the NFL playoffs, especially when you included and expanded it to 7 teams, I believe in like 2020, the allure of that was that you give another team a chance, right? You give another team a chance at the the playoffs, the postseason, things like that, and it always felt like with the 1-game elimination, you just truly never knew what was going to happen, right? That was the risk and excitement of it all, right? But now we're seeing that maybe the difference in quality of play has gone to a place where it's just really easy to determine who's going to win, and that, sort of unexpectedness and the excitement you get from an underdog story or something like that maybe might not be there as much as we've come to expect with some of these wildcard teams that, it's right there in the name, they're wild cards, anything can happen, but it really doesn't live up to that name, I feel like, at least over the last 2 years. And, why is that? Why is that something that I can't be the only one that's noticed it? I just feel like a lot of it has to do with the NFL now being very heavily based on just the offense, and it's all about the quarterbacks, right? It's all about the quarterbacks nowadays. The reasons for that, they're the main attractions, they're the most recognizable, they're the ones that bring in, the most attention to the game, and you're not disputing that, but, with it being so heavily based on who you have at quarterback, it's all about Patrick, Josh, Lamar, Jaden Daniels a little bit now kind of getting into that conversation, or even Jalen Hurts, I would say, in that conversation as well. Outside of those guys, you don't really see it being like a Sam Darnold, right? Like, they got destroyed in their game. A rookie quarterback like Bo, he kind of had it, but, it didn't really last too long. Jordan Love, another quarterback that's on the come up, but because he's not in this group, it's hard to, one, bet against these guys, but also, with their resumes and skill sets and, you really knowing the player profile, you pretty much know how the games are going to pan out when you have one of these guys. And unless you have a top 3 offensive line and either have like a generational talent at running back or wide receiver, or even like a fantastic, like, once in a generation type of defense, you're not really gonna stand a chance if you don't have a top tier, top 5, top 4 quarterback in the NFL. And it's unfortunate to kind of say it like that, but it's just how I feel like it's kind of going right now. And you get the higher seeds, obviously, because you are considered the better team. But again, going back to that point I made, when it's a 1-game elimination, you always have that unpredictability about it, right? That you can walk in and have a rough day, and the number 2 seed could be out of the playoffs, or the number 3 seed, like we saw, is out of the playoffs now. And that's why the NFL, I feel like, is a bit more of an attraction, or at least it's painted that way, because it is just win or go home. Whereas in the NBA, to kind of compare it to that, you look at the playoffs, and that's where it becomes more obvious, right? And I think that's where it's kind of justified, because in the NBA, you have a series, right, that you play. And usually when you play, best of 7, best of 5, and things like that, usually the better team wins that, because the worst team can kind of have a game or two where they get lucky or they play really, really well. But more often than not, the really good teams with the better players are able to move on. And that's why the NBA playoffs are kind of predictable. You kind of know who's going to be there in the end. And that's where the NFL kind of differed. But now, I think because of how the NFL is so heavily based on offense and quarterbacks and making sure that they affect the game as much as possible, you kind of take the excitement out of it a little bit, unless you have, like I said again, one of these generational type of guys. And also, to kind of add on to that, there's no way you can have any sort of unexpectedness, excitement about these games as well if the rules nowadays with the defense is or are laid out as they are, right? I think taking away some of the ferocity, some of the, I guess, leverage that defenses had back in the past where they were actually able to kind of create some sort of intimidation. I think that also, takes away from it. And it makes it even harder, right? For a defense to kind of impact the game, you think of, the first thing I think of is the Giants when they made that Super Bowl run with that great defense. A lot of it was just that they would take over the games, and they were really the overall main factor in that run of winning that Super Bowl. But now with the way the rules are, you can't really create that sort of impact on the defensive side as much as you did in the past as well. So yeah, you're not really having a great defense, make a run from the wild card spot nowadays. I just don't think it's really feasible with the rules nowadays as well. And, is there a quick solution to that? Is this just like a problem that we're just going to have to deal with going forward? You kind of know who's going to be there in the end. I think that because of how the NFL is obviously structured, right, with how it's so team oriented, right, and that's another thing that makes it great. You can't just change everything so quickly, I feel like, because almost everything matters, right? The special teams, defense, different pieces on defense, different pieces on offense. You need so much of a collective effort to really just make any sort of postseason run that any sort of quick resolution to maybe the playoffs being too predictable nowadays is not really plausible either. It's not like, you just go out in free agency and sign all the best players and, get a super team together, right? If you were to get a super team, like maybe the Eagles or something like that, it takes time. It's not like you could just bring all these guys together because the NFL is such a hard cap, sport overall. So that's another thing that there's no quick solution to just kind of spreading out the wealth, right? Because these teams, for there to be a Super Bowl run, you need a lot to go your way, right? You need to sign a lot of guys. Ideally, what we've come to realize is that having these young rookie quarterback, phenoms come in and make your run there, right? Where the quarterback is on a cheap deal, make it before you have to pay him a lot of money and start making decisions elsewhere, right? On where you're going to kind of cut corners with the salary cap. So, that to me seems to be the best alternative to kind of breaking the cycle a little bit is having a guy say Jaden Daniels come in and really be pushing to be one of those, 5 to 4 guys in the NFL, making a magical run like he looks like he is on right now is really the only alternative I see. And it's not like that's going to happen each and every year. You'd like it to. I'm sure these franchises would love that to happen with how they value the quarterback and how high, the quarterbacks just go in the draft. But again, it's not something that just happens each and every year. So that's what makes it even harder as well to kind of break this cycle, right? It just makes me think of, when you're comparing it to anything, it makes me think of movie franchises. Are you one of those people that likes watching the Fast and Furious franchise, right? 10 movies of knowing kind of what's going to happen, who's really going to be there, and you kind of know which characters are not going to end up dying or anything like that. Are you a fan of that, or are you a fan of remakes of a franchise, remakes of a movie, and having that unexpectedness, right? Not really creating any familiarity with any of the main protagonists, right? Some people are fans of that. So I think that also, kind of has to do with it. I would like to see a bit more of a sporadic, sort of result field in the wild card round and, going forward. But I think it is just what it is now until we just see just organizations figuring out the quarterback position, really. And that's really the only thing I can think of. And it's not like this awful thing that it is, but it's just something that was in my mind over the weekend on these wild card rounds are not really living up to the name. So I'd be interested to know what all you guys think about it. If you leave a comment or anything like that, let me know if you guys are not too big of fans of the wild card round and how predictable it is, or if you're on the opposite side of it. So that was something I noticed this past weekend. And speaking about this past weekend, one of those teams that was unfortunately blown out was the Minnesota Vikings. And looking forward now to 2025, we're going to discuss in this next segment what their quarterback situation is going to look like, right? Are they going to bring back Sam Darnold? Are they going to move off of him? Is it time for JJ McCarthy already coming off of that knee injury? We're going to discuss all of that after this break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Jumping right back into the action here on the Chip Shot Football Podcast, back into a little bit more of the quarterback talk, this time surrounding the Minnesota Vikings. The Minnesota Vikings, I think, are gonna be a very interesting case to follow over the offseason, and obviously how this situation with their quarterbacks is going to affect the draft and free agency, obviously, as to who they want to bring in and, what kind of team they want to have in 2025. Because overall, I think it's quite honestly like a harsh reality when you think about it, when you think of how Minnesota got to this point where, they were where they were back 3 weeks, right, when they were winning games, pushing the Lions to be the number one seed, right, in large part because of how Sam Darnold was playing during that run, and really I would say the majority of the regular season, how impressive Sam Darnold was playing, and how just so much of a just unexpected, out of left field story Sam Darnold was, right, because this was positioned for them to kind of groom J.J. McCarthy, a similar situation to like Drake May, and I guess like Michael Penix in a way as well. This was the blueprint, right? Kind of easing J.J. in with a guy like Sam Darnold, but then disaster strikes, J.J. gets hurt, he's out for the year, and now you got to start Sam Darnold, and he plays out of his mind, quite frankly. Nobody probably predicted him to play like this, play this well, and that was great for the Vikings, right? They were really taking advantage of this opportunity. But now that we arrive here a week after the wild card round, and I guess 2 weeks after that run of games against Detroit and against the Rams last week, a lot of people will give Sam Darnold credit for the regular season, but also will put a lot of blame on Sam Darnold with how the season ended. And that's just a harsh reality, right? It feels like, I can only imagine, right? I'm assuming here for Sam Darnold, right? That everybody just forgets what you did in the regular season, and, a game or two in the playoffs, obviously, is what people remember. And I think that's not wrong, but, it just feels harsh, like I said before, right? But it is the nature of it. It is the nature of the playoffs, and where everything ultimately matters. And that's what Sam Darnold also said as well after their game, right? How he just didn't make enough plays, and nobody ultimately really cares what you do until you get to the postseason where everything matters. So what do we do now, right? What do we do now with this Vikings team, with Sam Darnold, right? Does this mean that after another underwhelming season, after another disappointment and losing in the first round of the playoffs, does this mean that Sam Darnold is 100% not going to be there? I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say necessarily that they're just going to kick him out and there's no way he stays. But I do feel like they're going to want probably another team-friendly deal. They're probably going to ask Sam to kind of help them out and, take a much more friendly deal, right? And his value certainly dropped over the last 2 games, right? Because when everything was on the line, when everything was out there for you to play for against this one other team, you fell short, right? And it's not just the fact that you fell short, it's how you fell short. Only scoring 9 points in back-to-back games like that is definitely something that's going to be constantly brought up in these negotiations that Sam Darnold has. So I'm sure the Vikings now with that sort of leverage are going to ask him to bring down the price a little bit, kind of help them out. But, kind of putting myself in Sam Darnold's shoes, right? I'm sure he might feel like the regular season and the way he did play during the regular season and making the Pro Bowl and really helping the Vikings out in a spot where when your rookie quarterback goes down, say they didn't have Sam Darnold and had anybody else, would any other quarterback maybe have that much success that Sam Darnold would have had, this year? The leverage Sam has is that, you'll never know that answer, right? So he could say, without me, you might not have even gotten here, right, with any other quarterback. And if you're Sam, you try to drive up the price that way. And that's where, all the numerous discussions are going to happen, right, with that sort of narrative and talking point. But we could approach a reality where Minnesota does part ways with Sam and they move on from him, and now it's really just like JJ McCarthy, and I don't even think Daniel Jones is on a contract, right? I think this was the last year of his deal, if I'm not mistaken. So now you're really just left with JJ McCarthy if Sam Darnold moves on, right? A guy they drafted 10th overall to be, the quarterback one, the starter for this team. But the issue that we now run into is whether or not going straight to JJ McCarthy right after a knee injury and really not having any experience in his first year because of that injury, is that something that they're set up to do? Is that something that's even plausible or realistic for them to kind of approach as a real alternative, right? Because what's there to say that you even come close to the year you had this year? Could it potentially be worse with a rookie quarterback with no experience? You just kind of throwing him out there? Those are the kind of things that they're going to have to kind of wrestle with. And this team is well equipped, as well as really any other team, with Justin and Jordan Addison and TJ, and even, that offensive line a little bit. They really disappointed, but still, it's a solid group. Aaron Jones as well, some good pieces on the defense, and a great head coach, right? They're well equipped to compete, personnel-wise with a lot of these teams, but it's just all about the quarterback now, and it's obviously easier said than done to just fill in the quarterback, right? Everyone's trying to do that, and you can see how many teams have failed. So it must be now, ideally, for the Vikings, I think, to make sure they have that urgency, though, right? Because they do have a great team, and it might feel like, they're really set up to kind of go on a run here. But I feel like still there's got to be a bit of urgency because you are on that rookie contract right now. We mentioned it a couple segments ago, like being in this position that the Vikings are in a cheap quarterback deal with the kind of pieces that they have is one of the best spots to be in. And, if you don't decide to pay Sam Darnold and don't decide to go that way, and you could even go even cheaper, then right now we start thinking of other possibilities with this team. If you don't want to keep Sam and you decide that maybe his asking price is a little bit too high, but maybe you're not really ready to go to JJ yet, you look at other options out there, right? Maybe a guy like Daniel Jones, right? I'm assuming he's on the last year of his deal. That thought is escaping me. But if he is on the last year of his deal and he is going to be a free agent, you could go after him as a cheap option, as a, bridge quarterback. And, there's other guys like Jimmy Garoppolo is another one that has experience now being a backup, with the Rams, has connections with the Vikings general manager from their time in San Francisco. So Jimmy's another guy that's played in a lot of big games. He has that sort of mentorship about him that JJ can sort of benefit off of. Or even a guy like Trey Lance, I saw somewhere in an article where while Trey Lance was still in San Francisco, the Vikings were one of the teams that were interested in bringing him on before the Cowboys obviously eventually traded for him. But, if they decide to part ways with Sam Darnold, I think those three guys would be a couple great candidates for them to be just a bridge quarterback, right? Ideally, you would go into this season thinking the same way you did last offseason, where you were bringing in Sam to be this bridge quarterback, and he, blew all the expectations out of the water. So you would ideally be doing that same thing while still, having JJ come along and kind of ease him in. Because the reality is that, JJ, I like JJ McCarthy. I think he's going to be a great quarterback. I think he's going to be right in there with Bo and Michael Penix now, certainly. Jaden Daniels, I think that would be asking a lot, but who knows, right? I think he's going to be a very talented player for this team, right? He has a lot of big game experience. He has that leadership aspect about him, and he was just in a good professional program at Michigan. But coming off of an injury like that, you just don't want to throw him in, right? So I think the ideal scenario for me on what this quarterback situation could look like is I would make the hard decision of moving on from Sam, unless he's taking a very friendly deal. I think I'm just parting ways with that and going after one of these other cheaper options, and that way I kind of let JJ know that this could be a quarterback competition of some sorts, right? Much like it was this offseason, right? And I'd let him know that that's still the goal. It's still the goal to kind of have him move along and things like that, and see where he's at, after the preseason, after training camp and everything like that. And if he wins the job, that's great, right? If they feel like he can start right away, that's great, but there's no reason why they should rush him. So I feel like bringing on a guy like Jimmy Garoppolo or, Daniel Jones, right? They're good enough to do a decent enough job with this kind of roster. They're going to be fine, right? To kind of be like a Marcus Mariota or Kirk Cousins, just definitely not as expensive. Jacoby Brissett, those kind of guys, right? I feel like the Vikings could take that approach in 2025 if I was making the decisions, right? Obviously, but it seemed like they were very fond of Sam Darnold, so that's kind of also another reason why it might not just be like we're just going to move on from him. It looked like they had a really good relationship going there. So I'm sure that's going to play a part in it, but we'll see, right? We're just at the beginning of this entire thing. So we'll keep an eye on that as we move along. But the last couple segments here are revolving around the playoffs a little bit more. In this next segment, we're going to talk about the playoff teams that were eliminated this past weekend in the Wildcard round, looking at 6 teams here that need improvements, obviously, to make a deeper run, and we're going to point them out and just talk about them. Where could each of the teams that were eliminated in the Wildcard round this past weekend, where can they improve, and what it could mean for them, in this next coming year if they address those positions. So we'll be right back with that. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
We are back here now on the show, and we're going to do a little bit of recapping, kind of reflecting on what was for some of these wildcard teams that unfortunately were on the losing side of things this past weekend. And we're going to do a bit of reflection and look at the 6 teams that were eliminated this past weekend, and right away just point out areas of their team that they need to improve upon and why, it needs to be such an improvement at these spots, right? And I think it's clearer for a couple of these teams more so than it is for some of the other teams that lost in the wild card round. But on that point, we'll start with one of the first teams here that was on the losing end of things. We're going to be looking at the Steelers, right? The Steelers, one thing I would like to see them improve upon might not be so obvious to the general fan, right? It's the quarterback, it's the wide receiver, right? It's the head coach, maybe if you want Mike Tomlin to leave. But I think to me, the main thing that I'd like to see the Steelers improve upon is the lower levels, I guess, right? Like the position coaches, right? Those kind of guys focusing on those specific portions of this team. I think that certainly needs to be better. And I think that way because I feel like they have talent, certainly on the defensive side of the ball. They got guys to work with and to put out a better product than they did over the last couple of weeks here to end their season. And, they have that talent. They have all the guys, but clearly talent will only take you so far. And I think they need still an improvement on the guidance and direction of how they move and how they operate as a team. And specifically, I'm looking at positions like the defensive coordinator, right? Obviously, their offensive line certainly, I think, definitely needs a new position coach. And I would even venture to say their offensive coordinator. I think that would be a bit bold for the Steelers to just move on from Arthur Smith after just 1 year, but I wouldn't be devastated or shocked, right, by that move. Starting off with the offensive line, it's just too many missed assignments, too many guys bumping into each other, not knowing who to block, missing assignments, thinking that they got to double team one guy and one guy clearly just busts through one of the gaps and tackles the running back in the backfield, right? It just looks sloppy if you watch, the game from different perspectives, from different angles. You see how this offensive line is really struggling and really just hurting themselves on a lot of these plays. And it's just too sloppy to be considered a playoff team, quite honestly. These are just mistakes you make that you shouldn't make towards the end of the year. It's things that you kind of iron out, ideally in training camp or the first month of the season. But to still be missing blocks and not really knowing what your assignment is, I think that needs to be cleaned up, and that needs to, I guess, have another voice kind of operating that part of their team. For their defense, I just think also, not that it's been god-awful, like it certainly has been in some years with this team, but I just feel like it's time for a change. I think it's been too much of the same for a good amount of time now, but also with some of the personnel and some of the formations that they run out there, it is a bit questionable, and I'm left wondering watching these games they got guys on this team, right? Cam Hayward, TJ, Patrick Queen, Minka Fitzpatrick. They're working with things that a lot of teams would love to be working with, and still they're giving up bad performances. Just for a very niche sort of example, right? Looking at the game against the Ravens, there was a bunch of times, 22% of the time, where the Ravens lined up in a formation that had 6 offensive linemen. And the Steelers, throughout the entire course of the game, were in nickel, which is a lighter package, right? There's a lot more corners on the field in a nickel package. They were in that formation 45% of the time. They had 5 defensive backs on the field, a good amount of the time, and they were averaging giving up 9.5 yards per play. They were giving up 5 yards per play when they had 4 defensive backs on the field, and they were averaging 3.8 yards per play given up when they had 3 defensive backs on the field. And they ran that a good percent of the time against the Ravens. And when the Ravens are running a heavy package, heavy formation, and you're still throwing out there a lot of defensive backs, like something's not connecting there, right? We shouldn't be doing that, right? If you're part of the Steelers and, part of that operation, right? There should be someone saying, or an idea saying, that you should probably line up in a heavier formation with bigger bodies out there, right? That seems like an obvious thing to do, but that's just a very niche example of one thing. But that's certainly where I think the Steelers need to get better on. And then moving on to the Vikings, just coming off of a segment where we talked about them, I think that quarterback's obviously the biggest one, but I went with the offensive line and the defensive line, right? Because the offensive line, really the last 2 weeks looked just overpowered, outmatched, and just really stood no chance. And a lot of it, you can say falls on Sam for holding on to the ball too long, but in that same breath, there was just a lot of times where Jared Verse, Kobe Turner, Byron Young, they were just getting in his face, and it threw everything off. So I think doing stuff to improve the interior part of that offensive line would certainly help. It hurt that they didn't have Christian Darrisaw, right, with his knee injury, but, improving the interior offensive line with this team, and also the defensive line a little bit too, because outside of, like, Harrison Smith and Jonathan Grenard, I didn't really think they had somebody making a massive impact outside of those guys. If anything, they just need to add a little bit more depth so they're able to give maximum effort or not maximum effort, but they're able to have top-tier quality out there when they rotate guys in and out. So I think just adding a bit more depth to those spots would go a long way, because it's hard to point out a lot of glaring needs that this team is in need of, quite honestly. So I think the ugly part of the game is where I think the Vikings definitely need to get better at. Then the next team I have on here is the Los Angeles Chargers. Easily, just get more weapons, just get more pass catchers, more of a higher level of pass catchers. Don't just bring in anybody. Bring in established, guys that you could really trust, whether that be an experienced veteran, maybe like a Devontae Adams, or you could go someone like T. Higgins or something like that. Bring in someone like that. They need another guy outside of Vlad McConkey, because this team is right there. I truly believe that. I feel like they're going to improve on their defense regardless, right? That's something that they always want to have as a staple, but making sure you just bring some more help for Justin Herbert, right? Because I really think he's too good to be talked about as overrated or anything like that, right? I mean, he's throwing to a rookie wide receiver out there in his first year, and he's having a phenomenal year, but they need something else outside of it. I just think it's not fair to really just put it all on Justin when it's only really a rookie wide receiver out there, creating any sort of havoc. So get him any sort of weapons, establish guys, maybe target someone in the draft, get him something, for 2025. It'll help out a lot. Then for the Green Bay Packers here, I had a pass rush for them. I mean, their offense had a pretty rough year. Jordan Love had a pretty rough year, but I think they're going to be okay. I think they're going to be all right, because, wide receiver is another one that I could have gone with, but Romeo Doubs, Christian Watson, Jaden Reed, I think they're all right on the offensive side of the ball. To me, I went with pass rush because, especially against Philadelphia, it really felt like Jalen had a lot of time to throw back there, and not a lot of teams can say that they dominated this offensive line. It's usually a trend that this offensive line dominates most teams, but I need to see a little bit more of a push or a struggle from these guys, and I just feel like the Packers don't really give you that too much, outside of Rashawn Gary, who only had 7.5 sacks this year. Their next highest guy had only 5 sacks this year, and it came from a defensive tackle. So I'd like to see a little bit more edge pressure. I'd like to see some guys flying off the edges of this defense and really making quarterbacks uncomfortable, moving around in the pocket, and just helping their secondary out. Because I thought they played pretty well, especially when Jair Alexander went out, but I just think they need a little bit more help from the front part of their defense rather than the back end. So I went with pass rush for the Packers. I think that would help out a lot. And the last two teams I have on here, I have the Broncos. And to me, it's all about the run game. I think they need a legitimate running back to, like a guy you can identify as, that guy's their number one, right? You can have a backup. You can have a running back duo and things like that. That's fine. But I need to have someone that is clearly like their number one, right? Or you need to have two really good guys, like I guess the Lions do. But, you look at the Packers, they have Josh Jacobs clearly, and other guys backing him up. James Cook, I would say, is the main back, with Ray Davis and Ty Johnson also helping him out as well. Derrick Henry, he has Justice Hill, as a running back duo, and, all these guys, right? The Chiefs have Isaiah Pacheco while also spotting in Kareem Hunt. So I think the Broncos need someone like that, because Javonte Williams, Jaleel McLaughlin, and Audric Estime, they're all right. All three of them had between like 300 and 500 yards, but I just need like a bell cow sort of guy that could go in there and really kind of do it all and be spotted by maybe one of these guys or two of these guys in heading into 2025. I just feel like you need a 1,000-yard rusher, essentially, right? All three of these guys, if they combine into one running back, they would be a 1,000-yard rusher. So kind of cut down on the quantity and focus more on the quality for this team. Because, Bo Nix played great. He can even add to the running game as well. But when you have guys like Courtland Sutton, who's a clear number one, Marvin Mims, a deep ball threat kind of guy, Troy Franklin did some decent things for them as well. I think they're all right in the passing game. But really the running game was something that I felt like was much needed for a rookie quarterback that, kind of eases the pressure off of him a little bit. So that's really my biggest need for them. And lastly here, I have the Buccaneers. To me, they need a linebacker or some defensive back help. Really some depth there, because their pass defense wasn't great this year, but I feel like they're very thin at those spots, right? With Jamel Dean and Zion McCollum. They're pretty good, on the outside, but outside of those guys, if one of them or both of them were to get hurt, quite honestly, I don't know who else they would go to. I just don't know their names. So I think adding more depth there, more quality depth to the corner, and, just safety and really secondary spot overall would go a long way for them. And also I mentioned linebacker because you don't really know what's going to happen with Lavonte David. He could be retiring. He could be coming back for another year. You're not really sure. And he's been a stalwart in there for as long as I can remember, honestly. So, you have guys like KJ Britt, Chris Braswell, who they drafted this year as well. And they're solid, but I just need some more depth there as well. Maybe a veteran presence that you can throw in there along with some of these younger guys, right? It's all about depth with the Buccaneers. And because offensively, Baker, Jalen McMillan, Mike Evans, now that you have Bucky Irving, they're pretty solid on the offensive side of the ball. They were one of the highest scoring teams all year. So I think it's more about defense with them, especially with Todd Bowles. I'm sure he's going to want to improve that side of the ball, which he knows very, very well, having a defensive background. So those are all the teams that were eliminated this past weekend and where I think they can improve heading into 2025. But we got one more segment to go to, a bit of a preview to the divisional round, focusing on the 3 rematches that we have coming up in the divisional round, and just basically laying out one thing for each team to make sure they do in order for them to either win again, or if you were on the losing side of things, make sure to win this time around when you have another opportunity to do so. So we'll close the show out with that segment. That'll be coming up right after this. Thank you guys for joining me here for the last segment of today's show. Looking ahead a little bit to the divisional round here in today's show. Not really previewing or anything like that, but I just felt like it was interesting looking at these matchups a little bit ahead of things and realizing that we have 3 rematches going on in this phase of the playoffs, right? Out of all the matchups, right? Out of all 4 of the matchups, 3 of them have 2 teams that have already played against each other this season. 6 teams that are familiar, very familiar with their opponents. So I thought that was pretty interesting. You look at Kansas City and Philadelphia in their respective matchups, right? Both of them won the first time around, and now both of them are going to play that same team at home this time, right? The Chiefs play the Texans in Arrowhead during the regular season. Now they have the opportunity of playing them again at home in the playoffs. And for Philadelphia, they played the first game against the Rams in Los Angeles, right? And they ran all over them. And now they have the opportunity of playing them again in the comfort of their own home. So that's, going to have an effect on the games, obviously. And the only one that's not like that is Baltimore and Buffalo, because Baltimore won the first game at home, but now they're going to be playing in Buffalo, where obviously the Bills have not lost once in their home stadium this year. So there's a lot to pick off from these matchups, right, which makes it so much more interesting. But going through each team, going through, each scenario, I'm just going to provide one thing that is either going to help each one of these teams, win again, or, get some sort of revenge and win this time if they lost the first matchup. So we're going to start off talking about the Texans and the Kansas City Chiefs. For the Texans, one thing that I think they need to do to win this time around is just play cleaner football. And I know that sounds like a general statement, right? Everybody wants to do that, but it's not necessarily just clean, but I would just say a more efficient level of football, a more mature approach to these games, right? Because they didn't necessarily show that against the Chargers, where they had 6 penalties and 3 giveaways in that game, but they were fortunate enough to have Justin Herbert turn the ball over more than they did, and also, just have the Chargers and, their defense really get after Justin Herbert as well. So it's not like they didn't make mistakes. They certainly made a good amount of mistakes in this game, but it's just the fact that the Chargers made a lot more. So they didn't necessarily, play the cleanest of games, and they're going to have to really ramp that up to like a 10 or even like an 11, right? Because you're going up against one of, if not the team that hardly ever hurts themselves, especially at this point of the season in Kansas City, especially in Arrowhead as well, right? Because you talk about, just hurting yourself and playing sloppy football. In their first game in Arrowhead as well, it was only a 27-19 game, but we saw some of the same mistakes, right? The Texans were called for 6 penalties, where the Chiefs were only called for 2. There was only 2 giveaways, both by the Houston Texans, and 0 from the Kansas City Chiefs. Patrick Mahomes was only sacked 1 time, and the Texans only ran for 57 yards in their last game against the Chiefs. So being efficient, being on your X's and O's, crossing your T's and dotting your I's. I know it sounds meticulous, and I know it sounds like almost impossible to be perfect, and it kind of sounds like I'm asking them to do that, but try and avoid those situations where you take a unwarranted risk or just an unnecessary penalty, or you're just not playing smart, or you're not being very cerebral about the game. All aspects of football are covered when you're trying to knock off, the Super Bowl champion as well. So for the Texans, just make sure everything is accounted for. And, the Chiefs just might be a better team, but in games like this, it's definitely a lot more reassuring when you know that you did your best to not hurt yourself in this game, right? And if they just beat you, and you played a clean game, that's all right, but you definitely don't want to look back and think that, oh, we had 8 penalties and we gave the ball away one time, and usually that one time hurts you against Patrick Mahomes. So making sure to cut all those things out will be huge. And for the Chiefs, I think it's quite evident that the Texans defense really relies on their pass rush. Their pass rush really disrupted things for the Chargers, and just making sure, in a way, kind of like we mentioned with the Bills going into this game, or their pass game against the Broncos, just making sure that pass rush has other things to worry about, not just getting after Patrick Mahomes, because that's something that everyone's going to have to worry about, but making sure that you get them in situations where you're running the ball efficiently, not getting yourself in 3rd and 8s, 3rd and 10s, and things like that. Making Will Anderson, Danielle Hunter, Danico Autry, and these guys defend the run. Don't just take an extra step wider because you think you're just going to rush the passer all day. Make them stay in their gaps and make them tackle and kind of wear them down that way. And not only in the running game, but other responsibilities you could throw at them, like in pass coverage, or making sure that they account for, different responsibilities in zone coverage where, they got to account for Travis Kelce, that they move all over the place and create matchups, right? There might be an opportunity where, one of these edge rushers might have to account for Travis Kelce if nobody else is doing it, and things like that, right? Making sure that they are not just focused on rushing the passer, right? Disrupt their game that way. And also, in that respect, especially with the fact that in their last matchup, Joe Mixon didn't really have that much of an impact. This Houston Texans team, if they're going to win this game, they're going to need those guys to get after Patrick and things like that, right? Get after him and make sure that they're in his face. And if you can get a turnover that way, that's great for the visiting team. But really, for the Kansas City Chiefs, just limiting those splash plays, right? Holding on to the ball and making the Texans, in a way, also play the full 60 minutes, right? And that's where the Chiefs usually get teams to kind of fall off the track, is where they just outlast them. And they play as clean a football as anybody, like I said. So making sure that they're able to do that and really taking that pass rush away is going to be huge for them to win this matchup yet again. But moving on to the other game between the Rams and the Philadelphia Eagles, right? For the Rams, last game, they focused a lot on getting after Sam Darnold, and I think that was evident, right? Like the Lions did, right? Getting after him, getting in his face, and, putting a lot of pressure on him, right? But this time around, going up against the Eagles, I think for them, it's all about Saquon. It's all about those guys making sure Saquon doesn't, break out a 30-yard run in or through their gap that they're supposed to be in, right? Making sure that Saquon's not the one that just beats you on his own. And it's tough when they have A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, right, and Jalen Hurts who could take off. But I think in this game, it's more than important to just limit Saquon and really have him as the guy to not beat you, because I'd like to see Jalen Hurts, have an opportunity to try and beat you, right? I mean, A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith are great. They definitely help out in that regard. But I think once you get to the crucial plays, like in the red zone and things like that, if the Rams fully focus on taking Saquon away and he's just not getting anything all game, and you really make Jalen beat you with his arm, he could pick you apart. He could go up and down the field with drives, just throwing the ball. He's a good quarterback, right? Obviously, but once you get into those tight areas, once you get into the red zone, and those throws from Jalen have to be super accurate, right? If they play like a good zone coverage in the red zone, then you're forcing Jalen to be very accurate and very, perfect in a way in some of these throws. And more often than not, a quarterback is not going to be able to keep that up for the majority of the game. And the Eagles, I'm sure, are still going to run the ball, but or at least try to. But if you're the Rams, really limit that and take that away. And if you could play great coverage, great zones in the red zone and just hold the Eagles to field goals instead of touchdowns, and just focus on Saquon more so than not, I think they're going to have a good opportunity, especially with the kind of offense that they have. So taking away Saquon and making Jalen Hurts try and beat you, I think is their best opportunity to win this game. And then on the other side of things, looking at the Eagles side and how they could get another win over the Rams, I think for them is making sure that they are on Matthew Stafford all day long, that their pass rush is getting to him very, very quickly. Again, easier said than done, but Matthew Stafford, passing-wise, I think, we saw it a lot last game where he could just beat you with his arms. So knowing that that's a huge part of their game alongside with Puka and Cooper Kupp and all those sort of guys, right? It seems like that's their MO. So taking them off their usual sort of rhythm and things like that and making Stafford throw it quicker or throwing off his rhythm and things like that, they have the guys to do it in man coverage. So if you got to bring another guy, blitz Matthew Stafford, he's not going to take off anywhere really. So you got a good opportunity with guys like Jalen Carter, Nolan Smith, Josh Sweat, and those guys to get after Matthew Stafford. And if you do that and you get them in second and third and longs, because their defensive line's very good enough to hold Kyren Williams down, I think. They're good enough to do that. So if they're able to keep Kyren in check a little bit, but really mainly focus on Matthew Stafford with the kind of corners that they have, I think that'll be a great starting point where they could really do that. And if they're able to be successful with that, then I think they'd be in a good spot to win this game on when is it? Is it on Sunday? I believe it's on Sunday. So that's that matchup. And then just looking at the last two teams here, looking at the Baltimore Ravens, what I'd like to see them do is take more of an advantage of those one-on-one matchups that I feel like the Buffalo Bills are going to give them on Sunday, the last game on Sunday, right? Because last time, all the wide receivers only caught one pass. All of them only caught one pass outside of Justice Hill. And it was really all about Derrick Henry, right? He took over that game. The running game took over. And they just outmuscled the Bills. So for the Bills this time around, it's going to help out a lot that Matt Milano's back for them. And they're just going to have to get out of that comfort zone of playing zone and really load that box up very heavy. And it's going to force you into man coverage a lot of the times, right? But I feel like taking away Derrick and not having him just solely beat you, sort of like Saquon, I think would be the way I would approach things if I was thinking like the Bills, right? I feel like they're going to load up that box and try and take him away, unlike last time. So if they do that, for the Baltimore Ravens to win this game, I think, take advantage of that. You know that the Bills aren't really accustomed to being in man coverage. They do prefer zone more often than not. And I know you might not have Zay Flowers for this game, but take advantage of someone trying to cover Isaiah Likely one-on-one, trying to cover Mark Andrews one-on-one, or even Rashad Bateman. Those are good matchups that I think still favor the Baltimore Ravens. So while Buffalo is focused on taking away Derrick Henry, and they might be successful with that, with how many bodies they have around the offensive line, you're going to have good matchups on the outside. So making sure that Lamar is able to be accurate and take advantage of those one-on-ones, I think they kind of have an edge there as well. So that's what I'd like to see the Ravens do. But the last team we have on here is obviously the Bills. And the way I think that they can change something to win this time around is like spreading the Baltimore defense out as much as they possibly can. Make it so that they have more defensive backs out there. Make it so that they're not just loading up the box in and around Josh Allen. Because the Ravens, I feel like the Ravens want to try and outmuscle you. They want that hard-nosed, heavy personnel out there to try and beat you that way. I think that plays more to their style. More power over finesse, heavy formations, like I said. I think that's what the Ravens ideally want to do and where I feel like they are most comfortable. But with all the options that the Bills have, like like Keon, Amari Cooper, Khalil Shakir, both their tight ends, even the running backs that they have out there, spread them out as wide as possible and, have that Ravens defense worry about a lot of guys in the passing game rather than just being in a condensed area. Because in a condensed area, I feel like the Ravens are a lot more successful, just out-muscling you. But in terms of a spread offense, having 4 wide receivers out there or just 4 guys out wide and just spread out all over the field, it forces the Ravens to be a bit more disciplined when it comes to their zones or their assignments and things like that. And not only that, but I think there's just more space for throws to be made from Josh Allen, and not only for him passing-wise, but running the ball as well. You don't want everybody to be condensed when you have a guy the size of Josh Allen trying to run the ball. There's going to be nowhere to go. So if you also spread everybody out in the passing game, it gives Josh a lot more room to look through all of his reads, and if no one's there, there's a lot more space for him to just take off and run. I feel like they didn't do that enough in their first game. So spread this defense out a lot. Make sure that they're disciplined in their assignments, and if not, you can make some throws, or you could just take off if you're Josh Allen and really take control of this game. That's, in my mind, what I feel like each one of these teams can do to either win again or get some sort of revenge from their first matchup. So we're going to dive into these matchups a lot more over the next couple of days, but for right now, that is going to be it for this show. I want to thank you guys for joining me on today's episode, and please remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show, as well as following the network on all forms of social media. If you want to see more of the Chip Shot Football Podcast, please check out the GSMC Sports Network channel and the GSMC Podcast Network channel on YouTube, obviously, where you can see more content around the NFL, and with us, more breaking news, coverage, previews, breakdowns, and all just different coverages around different stories around the NFL. Again, with me, Manny Maradiege, as your host. Thanking you guys again for joining me, and I'll be back here again tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and I would like to see all you guys join me again tomorrow.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't